Welcome to episode 96 of The Green Life. In today's episode, we're going to talk about nutritional science, and we're going to talk about the best, easy way to explain all the headlines and buzzwords online with Dr. Gil Carvalho. Dr. Carvalho has created a wonderful channel on YouTube called Nutrition Made Simple, and there he really lays out what the science says versus what headlines say. And I think that's really, really important for us to know because it's a minefield out there. Okay, before we get into the episode, a big shout out to Nama Well for the J2 juicer, a juicer I truly swear by because the juices are amazing and I have one every day at least. And I also want to shout out to them for the C2 because now they have a blender, and if you are interested in upgrading your kitchen appliance with one that does it all, then the C2 is definitely for you, and you can grab a 10% discount in the show notes. I'm not an affiliate, but the discount is a gift by Nama. Now, I want to say that I also have other links to Dr. Morse's Herbs, Newsest, Wonder Workshop, to give an example, and I am an affiliate to those. So if you want to support the channel, please buy the herbs, buy the protein powders and the green powders, buy the amazing Ayurvedic herbs from these brands. They are brands I personally use, and you will support my channel. So I also want to say I have my links on the show notes. So if you want to work with me or interested in learning more about what I do at my retreat here in Portugal, please do check it out. And that's it. We can get into this amazing episode with our beautiful guest, Dr. Carvalho. Welcome to The Green Life. Hello, Dr. Carvalho. Thank you so much for being on The Green Life today. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So your work on your channel, Nutrition Made Simple, is amazing because I think you actually do really make it simple. So thank you for that. So most people will know you. Most people will know your channel has grown massively in the last few years. But I'd love for you to give just an introduction about you and your work and how you got into moving from actually practicing medicine to creating a podcast where you are explaining science and really shining a little bit of light on the pitfalls of medical field when it comes to nutrition, but also highlighting how social media can make things very confusing and how we have to draw it back a little bit to understand it. So yeah, give us a little bit about the background about you.
Sure. So I went to medical school back a lifetime ago. And then I wanted to do more research. I wanted to learn more about scientific research directly, because in medical school, you don't learn that much about kind of basic science and how research is done and interpreted and all that. So I went to graduate school right after medical school, moved to the US, spent most of my adult life there doing research. After grad school, got a number of jobs in academia, doing research in different fields, from gerontology to effective nutrients on lifespan, neuroscience, et cetera, genetics. And then about 5 years ago or so, I wanted to do something related to communication and kind of bridging this gap between the science and the public. And one of my areas of interest was nutrition, something that I had done some work in, and that I thought there was a lot of potential because there's enormous public interest, but there's a huge gap between what is known and what gets to the public. And so I started making videos slowly at first, just kind of, getting my feet wet and just kind of trying to translate a little bit what's out there. And slowly it grew, and lately it's been good. It's growing more and more, and we're getting a lot of interesting people, researchers, to come on and explain different areas of science. So it's really cool. And just today, a video came out. It's almost weekly now that there's something in the media that people are scared about. And now it's almost by viewer request. People hit me up and say, hey, this week they're saying that fasting kills you. They're saying that too much protein kills you. And so people want somebody to go over the research and kind of give an objective breakdown, because these headlines are often sensationalized or too simplified, and it's hard to really make heads and tails of those news pieces. So yeah, that ends up being a part of what I do, and also going over some of these common questions in nutrition, all kinds of things that maybe we'll touch on.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think we can actually start with today's headline episode that you had, because I did a very snapshot video of it too. because I do actually love fasting. And one thing that I've gotten really interested in is fasting as a woman and looking at our cycle, because I've been teaching how to manage our cycle and understanding the different phases of our cycle, because a lot of us are not even taught that, although we live with our cycle for like, 40 years and plus. And so I really wanted to touch on that, because I feel like it was very oversimplified. And I started questioning it when I saw Dr. Joel Kahn sharing it, because he said a large study, but then when I looked at it, it's actually not really a study that is really, it wasn't randomized, it wasn't controlled, it was just an hypothesis, more or less an observation. And I love how you actually explain also how to look at studies. But in any case, people would have seen this by the time this podcast comes out in a couple of weeks. People would have seen this headline, would be hopefully would have checked out your video by then. But if they haven't, what is it with fasting? Because a lot of people are yes, no, it works, it doesn't. I mean, I know it doesn't kill people. What is your take according to the science?
So fasting in general seems to be a very valid way of moderating calories, at least that the science seems to validate that. There's a lot of trials looking at fasting and a lot of benefits, especially if you start with people who are not the healthiest at baseline, so a little overweight or pre-diabetic or diabetic or insulin resistant, with the markers that are a little off, which unfortunately is most of the Western world at this point. And you get people to fast, you very often, not every time, there are studies that find no significant improvement. So it depends on how you do it, like everything else. But it's very consistent that you see improvements, some weight loss, some metabolic improvement. These markers tend to improve. And very interestingly, they've done analyses, large scale, actually doing meta-analyses and these more like large scale comparisons between fasting and just controlling calories, but without fasting. So just eating less calories continuously. And in general, they seem to match. When you match for calories, you get the same results, essentially, whether you reduce calories by blocking out times of windows that you don't eat, or whether you just eat a little bit less continuously. The end result seems to be roughly similar. So this seems to be essentially a personal preference. Some people love fasting. We have viewers who apply fasting and it helps them maintain healthy body weight or reach healthy body weight, put diabetes and prediabetes in remission sometimes. So it can be an incredibly powerful tool that some people love and apply to great success. Other people don't like it, doesn't work for them in the sense that they don't enjoy spending these blocks of time fasting. Some people tolerate it really well. They don't feel that hungry. Actually, after the fasting, they get used to it and the hunger pangs come down. Other people just don't do well and they get super hungry and they go sometimes and overcompensate and eat more later on. So there's some individual variation there, but for people who integrate it and find it useful, I think it's brilliant. I mean, as I usually say sometimes jokingly in my videos, that as internet fads go, fasting is my favorite because it doesn't involve anything like super crazy. You don't have to go eat something that's super harmful. You're just eating less. And for a Western audience, it's hard to go wrong with that when you're recommending a diet that where they eat a little bit less, they moderate the amount of calories that they take in, and you can call it whatever you want. It's interesting that if you call it eat less, people hate it, but if you say fasting, people and say it's ancestral, people love it. Hey, whatever helps, whatever gets the results. But yeah, I think it's a great tool that works for some people. It's not obligatory, like you don't need to fast. There are other ways to get the same results, but perfectly valid and productive way to get there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I think taking it back to basics, everybody fasts. When we go to sleep, we're not eating. So that's why our first meal is called breakfast, breaking fast. But I think, yeah, like everything, it needs to become a headline or very sensationalized at times. And of course, it needs to also cause, arguments because people are literally arguing online about this. So thanks for that. Yeah, I agree with you. From what I saw, it works for a lot of people for the reasons that you explained. It might not work for someone that just feels like they're gonna die if they don't have like 5 meals a day. And so it really is a personal choice. I personally reversed type 2 diabetes using fasting together with my whole food plant-based diet. And I like to segue into your food of choice. I know that you're very non-dogmatic about diet and that you explain what science shows to be a healthy approach to diet, aiming a lot to the Mediterranean approach and not the way we eat in the Mediterranean countries. That's something a little bit different to what we look at when we look at studies. But you are on a whole food plant-based diet now, I believe, mostly, right?
Yeah, I mean, mostly whole foods, although not 100%. And I would say the vast majority of my calories come from plant foods, but not 100% either. So yeah, I would say maybe a modified Mediterranean diet, or if you need a label, that's probably what we the simplest one.
Yeah. So when did you get interested, I would say, about your diet when you started changing? Because I guess like everybody else, you probably ate a mostly standard Western diet for a while.
Yeah, maybe in my 20s or maybe early 30s. So a while back, that I started making changes myself, just experimenting with things and trying to optimize blood work and things like that. At the time, I think I started before I was really going, mega nerdy on the research. And then later on, when I really started to do the deep dives and kind of after all of grad school, and once I better understood how to kind of grasp the balance of evidence, definitely changed my views on a number of things, and that has impacted the way I eat as well and the people around me. But there are also some things that I do personally that aren't necessarily necessary. Let's say, for example, I avoid one thing I've said in many videos. I tend to avoid fish and seafood most of the time because of the evidence on the impact on the environmental impact that it has. But the evidence on nutrition is pretty positive for fish and seafood. So I explain that all the time on the videos, that we can do something personally and not necessarily try to tell people that it's unhealthy. Like it doesn't, you know what I mean? A personal decision can be different from the balance of evidence. Just like somebody can prefer not to eat something because they don't like it, it doesn't mean the food is unhealthy. So that's one example. There are many others, things that I kind of optimize for myself. But what we try to do in the videos are little, if any, is about my personal choices. It's usually going over studies or going over evidence on different questions and kind of giving people that evidence so that they can make their own informed decisions as I have made mine.
Yeah. And do you ever see people asking you, obviously, when it comes to things like seafood where you don't eat, asking you if any of it has got to do with things like heavy metals or microplastic? I know you did a video about microplastics actually, but that's a question that comes up a lot, right? Because obviously we know that unfortunately we have all these elements in the water, and the fish will eat everything that they find, and heavy metals could be a concern. I know it depends on the fish, but if people are concerned about these two factors, what would you say the best approach is?
So there's two angles to this, exactly as we were saying. There's kind of the evidence that we have, and then there's personal choice. So the evidence that we have is that eating some fish, and we can talk about types of fish because it varies. This balance between the omega-3s and the accumulation of contaminants depends on the type of fish, depends on how high up the food chain they are. But the fish that are normally recommended are fatty fish, like salmon, for example, or sardines or something like that, a couple of times a week. That's a pretty standard recommendation. And those are types of fish that, if you look at analyses, they hit a pretty nice sweet spot between the amount of these healthy fats and not having high levels of contaminants, as opposed to things like, for example, swordfish or some types of bass, which are higher up the food chain, and depending on the environment, also the marine environment, they accumulate more of these contaminants. So that's kind of the scientific evidence. And that's why it's still recommended. Eating a fish a couple of times a week is still recommended. Now, there are also some people that might, that might change. For example, if you're pregnant or something like that, the recommendations might change. There are a little more sensitivity. Then there's personal choice. Some people might say, well, whatever, I don't want to chance it at all. Like I have viewers who just prefer to not even go there, and I'll just get my omega-3s from other sources. I think that's a valid personal choice. We don't have scientific basis to tell people, oh, don't avoid all fish because contaminants make all fish unhealthy. That's not supported by the evidence.
Mm.
Because what we call the outcome evidence is the actual risk of heart disease and cancer and diabetes and these things. In general, cardiometabolic risk tends to be improved in populations that consume more fish. So there's nuance there, as with everything else, and we can get into the weeds if you like, but that's kind of the more bird's eye view of the whole thing. Sorry, there's a phone ringing in the background.
I know, I can't hear it. I can't hear it. I was gonna say, let's get into the seaweed of it.
Into the seaweed, yeah. Seaweeds. Some people get, for example, their iodine and things like that from seaweed. That's a valid way to do it. Because one concern when people eliminate all fish and seafood is iodine. Although we get iodine in the West from salt a lot. Most salt is iodized. Milk is another source of iodine common in the Western diet, interestingly. And it might come from like sterilization of the cow udder and sterilization of the vats and all these strange things, but it ends up iodizing the milk in the end. So it's a source of iodine, a significant source of iodine in the Western diet. But so a lot of times people who are more plant-based eliminate these foods. They eliminate the dairy, they eliminate, and sometimes this also has this component of reducing salt as well. So that's one thing to bear in mind. We actually have a video on salt coming out soon going over this, that if you're trying to reduce the added salt in your foods, think about iodine and make sure you're getting it from somewhere else.
Yeah, I take kelp. I try to go for the more natural approach because I know there's also debate about having supplements and iodine supplementation not being ideal as a supplement. So as an isolated element versus just taking kelp, which contains iodine. Maybe we can actually explore that, how your feelings are about supplements, and if you think that they are a valid option. Because again, especially, so I'm fully plant-based vegan. So in my community, generally, there is a debate about taking supplements or not. My view is personally, don't guess when you can know. So do test your things like B12, vitamin D, which are often the ones that are lacking most. And if you can do other panels, that's great. You know, of course, you have to probably pay for them, but they're worth taking sometimes. Especially if you're feeling fatigued. Iron could be another one. But generally speaking, yeah, I mean, of course, we want everything to come from our food, but then there's obviously a debate about how much nutrients density there is in our food that we have now versus before because of how our terrains are treated. And this is an ongoing subject. And I do not know if it's can be, you know, geographic specific. Like in the US, obviously, they probably are a little bit worse off when it comes to agriculture versus us here in Europe, especially Portugal, still a heavy agricultural country where a lot of people are adopting a lot of permaculture, biodynamic, organic agriculture, which is awesome. So I think it would definitely impact the quality of our food. But when it comes to supplementation, what is your take, and how should people approach it?
In general, it's go with the evidence. So I think in some cases, supplementation is there's exaggeration and there's a lot of salesmanship and a lot of hype. A lot of supplements that are sold aren't necessarily, there's not strong scientific evidence that they do anything. I think cases where supplementation does make sense is, for example, if you have a documented deficiency and you're adding back the nutrient, that's a case where it makes sense. Also, as you were saying, if for some reason you're not getting enough of a certain nutrient from your diet because of different dietary preferences or dietary restrictions, some people can't get enough. And so that's another case where I think it makes sense. And B12, for example, is a key example because we have a lot of evidence that supplementing B12 is very effective. It reverses deficiency. And so I think it's a perfectly valid way to get B12. But there are other ways for people who are not comfortable taking a supplement for whatever reason. They can get it from fortified foods. Now, some people say, oh, that's also supplementing. Yeah, it's in a way you're supplementing. Interestingly, if you're getting a B12 from animal products, a lot of times you're also supplementing indirectly because depending where you're getting it from, a lot of these animals are raised with antibiotics in their food. And so the bacteria that produce B12 in their guts are killed, and then they're supplemented with B12. So you're essentially getting this supplement indirectly. But Yeah, those are kind of the three main sources that people use: the supplements, so the pill, or the fortified foods, or the animal products. And all three have compelling evidence that they work. They get you the B12 if you don't have some metabolic issue that prevents absorption. And that's actually common, especially after a certain age. So some people need to bear that in mind as well in terms of doses and sources. But yeah, my point with the supplementation in general is look for things that have documented evidence, and I'd say heed the salesmanship.
Yeah. Yes, we should definitely do that. I mean, I'm not saying that if a doctor has its own brand of supplements is a bad thing. Some of them really want to invest in quality. Like, I know Dr. B, Dr. Walt, oh, I can never remember his name. The gut doctor. I call him Dr. B because it's much easier, Baltovich. He's coming out with probiotics, and I know because that he really wanted to do that because it's like the standards in on the markets are not great, and for people that need a little bit of support, I wanted to create something great. So I think that's awesome. So I think the logical question about this would be, how do we identify which supplements are good quality, which are not full of fillers? What are we looking for when we look at the ingredients list?
So I mean, I go by the evidence, and I think one thing that concerns me is that a lot of times supplements, because I know the U.S. System a bit better than the European system. In the U.S., there's very little regulation with supplements. You can basically sell almost whatever you want, supplement-wise. There's so little regulation. It's shocking. We made a video recently about that, going over a little bit that world, and it's crazy what you can get away with. And so essentially a lot of supplements that are sold on the internet, over social media, by influencers, have never been tested. They go straight from having an idea to putting something together and just selling. So my main message would be, ask if it's been tested, especially if it's something proprietary. So if it's a supplement that nobody else sells, that has a funny name or a name that they came up with, one of these catchy names, Gut Protect and Gut Shield and all these things. If it's something that only they sell, because they will tell you right on their advertising page, they will tell you, oh, it's a mix of these things that we came up with. Cool. Did you guys run this? Did you guys test this somehow? Did you run a small trial, even if it's a small one? If no trial has been conducted, you don't know. Essentially, it's a guess. You're the guinea pig when you're buying that stuff. It might not do anything. It might be just like a placebo, or it might have some detrimental effect. There's no knowing if it hasn't been tested. So that's my main caveat. And then in terms of the components, yeah, you can usually look up what the components are, and then you can investigate them one by one. This will vary a lot from country to country. Some countries are tighter in terms of what they allow. The US, I mean, as long as you can pretty much put together, as long as they're not novel ingredients, you can put together a supplement with ingredients that are already out there and make some concoction that has never been used before and sell direct to people without having to show efficacy or safety or anything, which, when you think about it, is crazy. But that's kind of the reality. So I would just say, also, I don't have a position that is cynical. I don't think that supplements are all ineffective or all, snake oil. I think some supplements are very effective, and it's a matter of proving it.
Do you take any supplements?
So I'll sometimes take an algae oil, but none of my supplements I'm like religious about, because I do eat things that kind of, there's some redundancy there. But if I go a while where I haven't had any fish or anything like that, and I might have some algae oil instead. There's a B12 supplement, but I also am not religious about it because I do have alternative sources. So I don't feel that I absolutely need one. Vitamin D sometimes if I haven't been if it's like in the winter or something, or I haven't been outside during the sun hours. Yeah, I'll sometimes do that, but it's not something that I'm very strict about.
Yeah. It's funny about vitamin D. Every time I'm testing my clients, vitamin D here in Portugal, it's awful. I mean, I know we're in the north and, it rains a lot. But even in the summer, sometimes I'm like, are you guys vampires? Like, you need to be outside in the sun sometimes.
Yeah.
Like the vitamin D, I've seen some really low levels, like a 12, a 7. I mean, low. Like, I don't know how you are alive, kind of thing.
Mm.
It's quite something. So I prefer to suggest taking a vitamin D, especially living up here, especially in the winter, than not at all, because obviously we know the impact on the immune system and how, like, I guess not just the immune system, but I guess everything in our body is contributes to a pathway. So having deficiency is not really great. It's better to be safe than sorry when our things that we know are proven not to be harmful. But yeah, it's fascinating living in a European country that is Mediterranean, like close to, where it's sunny most of the time. After living in the UK and actually seeing that, God, there's so many deficiencies of vitamin D here. So interesting. I don't know if it's different in Lisbon. I normally have local clients or international clients who live in the UK, and even there is like, okay, vitamin D supplementation. But a very interesting approach. And I personally feel like I take it during the winter, but in the summer I do make an effort to be outside wisely. Of course, I don't want to get burned and get problems with our skin, but have sun exposure for sure, and like enjoy making my own. I think something else that I really want to segue into, when you mentioned a lot of influencers sharing information online, selling their products. So to mind, it comes to me this approach, this new, I want to say new in brackets, trend of lots of influencers talking about a specific diet, which is meat only diet. So the carnivore approach. And I like your take on this because it obviously causes a lot of debate, as everything does. But we know the evidence when it comes to cardiovascular disease and eating a diet that is very high in saturated fats. But I think even then, people seem to be confused. And so I like to actually really shed a bit of light here. If we can go into details even about the saturated fat, cholesterol, and making people understand what we should look at when we look at parameters of health. And when it comes to cholesterol, something else people are really confused about, because again, online you would hear these influencers talking about cholesterol being really high and being excellent for you versus the recommended average levels not being accurate. So, I know Saladino was talking about even having, I don't know, 500, and it was like, this is completely normal. You shouldn't worry about it. And also if we could talk about ApoB, something that is finally coming more to the surface. So yeah, I'm shooting a lot of questions at you at once, but I like a package of cardiovascular disease 101 for people that are really confused about this because of the influencers online.
Right. So I'll try to touch on some of that, and then you direct me or remind me if I haven't touched on.
Yeah.
You know what I've learned, and we have viewers from all walks of the nutrition world. We have viewers that eat only plants. We have viewers that don't eat plants. We have viewers that all kinds of things. And some people are following for different reasons. They just like to see what we say, or they want a contrary view, whatever. And in my experience, these ideas that all of science, all the cardiologists are wrong, everything is wrong, all the scientists are wrong. There's somebody on the internet that figured it out by himself in his basement. A lot of times I've learned it's not really that people, I wonder if they really believe that in their core, but the question is that people have, a subset of people have these intolerances. They have food intolerances, they have conditions that a lot of times they haven't had solved or addressed properly. And they've had really difficult stories with the healthcare system. And so they've had a lot of suffering. And then they encounter somebody on the internet that tells them, look, just eat this thing and try it. And they try it and they find symptomatic improvement that they never experienced before, right? And we can go into more details of that. I've had family members that went through this. We have videos covering this. The bottom line here is this: when somebody has a personal story of suffering and difficulty that was never alleviated by the healthcare system, and sometimes was made worse, and then they encounter somebody, whatever that source is, that provides something that gives them a subjective improvement, or even an objective improvement in terms of blood work as well. That is such a powerful experience that a lot of these people don't even care. I don't care about studies. I don't care what scientists say. I'm feeling so much better now than I was, that this must be it. And then all of these ideas come sort of as dominoes. So if this is working, then that must mean that all the scientists are wrong. If this is working and my cholesterol is high and I'm feeling so good, it must mean that high cholesterol is good for me. All these things come kind of attached. And there's an emotional aspect that is so strong that sometimes going over evidence and going over bar graphs doesn't connect, because that's not the level at which people have these strong beliefs. So that's just to explain kind of what I think is behind a lot of this controversy, let's say. At a scientific level, it's not really controversial that ApoB, elevated ApoB, is a causal risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The evidence is overwhelming. I mean, you don't find any real scientific contradiction on this all over the world in cardiovascular organizations. Does that mean that everybody with high ApoB is going to have a heart attack? Of course not. Every risk factor works statistically. Some smokers never have lung cancer. Some overweight people never have diabetes. So this always works as a conjunction. It's a Venn diagram. You need the exposure to risk factors and you need an individual susceptibility. But in a population exposed to high ApoB, you will have more heart attacks and more strokes than in a population that has ApoB in the healthy range, everything else held equal. So what else can I say about this? What I would do is I would just bring up two things. For people who have these intolerances and who find these restriction diets, and there's many types of these restriction diets where they find relief, there's two things that come to mind. One is trying to understand the condition that was alleviated, because the fact that you feel better doesn't necessarily mean that the condition is solved, and you could even in the long run be creating more problems for yourself. I say this, and I'm not a fan of anecdotes. I think they're very limited and very slippery and very hard to make sense of anecdotes. But to illustrate, sometimes it's okay to look at something as long as we understand it's not proof of an overarching scientific truth. So I've had in my own family people who had these issues with gastrointestinal conditions, and they had these intolerances to a lot of plant foods, and they had to go on some of these restriction diets. So there's something called the low FODMAP diet, which is something routinely used in gastroenterology for people with conditions like IBS and things like that. And so I think a lot of times these elimination diets are mimicking that effect. So the point here is that these family members went on these elimination diets. We then address the underlying issue, and they're now on a diverse diet again. They eat whatever they want. Foods that caused absolutely devastating effects. So they would eat some beans or some broccoli or cauliflower. They would be on the floor, no exaggeration, in pain. And a couple of months later, they were as tolerant as I am. They could eat a plate of whatever they wanted. So the message is that sometimes, I'm not saying this happens, it depends case by case, but sometimes these underlying issues can be resolved if we understand what's going on and if we address them. And you can go back to whatever diet you want to eat. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you have to be on a restriction diet longer term for whatever reason, consider addressing the kinks. Every diet is going to have shortcomings, just like we were talking about B12 in vegans, right? Every diet is going to have caveats that you need to bear in mind. If you're a vegan and you want to deny that B12 is an issue, I don't need B12, that's a mistake. And you might run into problems long term. And so if you're on a diet that raises your ApoB, and there's no way you are not willing or able to address that nutritionally, consider lowering it pharmacologically. That's one situation where it makes sense, because it's better than being exposed to a risk factor in the long run. Whether it's ApoB or high blood pressure or high glucose or tobacco, all of these things, you don't want. The problem is long-term exposure, consistent long-term exposure. So that's a very quick touching on something that's a vast topic.
I think I need to ask you this, though, for people that don't know what ApoB is. Also because people are familiar with HDL and LDL. They always find it on their blood work. But ApoB is not always asked as a test by their doctor. So most people don't even know it. Can we explain the difference between HDL, LDL, and ApoB?
Yeah. So I went kind of
high level,
high level, but I never went back into the weeds. Yeah. So basically, these fats that we transport in our body, the cholesterol and the triglycerides, these are types of fat, types of lipid. And as we all know, fat and water doesn't mix, right? It clumps up. So the body had to come up with a solution to transport fats in the bloodstream. And the solution it came up with are these vehicles called lipoproteins. So basically, the fats are transported covered by some proteins and some parts of fats that connect better with the water. Bottom line, they package the fats in these little microscopic beads, and those things can float around in the blood fine. So those are lipoproteins. LDL is a lipoprotein. HDL is a lipoprotein. ApoB is a protein on the surface of those lipoproteins. So if you think of a golf ball with maybe like some kind of string tied around it, the ApoB would be kind of that string or some tag on the surface, right? So the reason it matters is because not all lipoproteins are problematic. So the HDLs don't get lodged in the artery wall and don't cause heart disease, but the lipoproteins that carry ApoB as a tag, as a marker, do. So those are the LDLs, the VLDLs, the IDLs, Lp(a). There's a whole family of characters, but all of those guys carry ApoB on the surface. So when you measure ApoB, it's giving you a readout of those problematic lipoproteins. So when that's too high, that's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and bringing that back down to the normal range is protective populationally. So yeah, LDL, the test that we normally get is LDL cholesterol, which, not to complicate this too much, but it's actually not measuring the LDL lipoproteins. It's measuring the amount of cholesterol being carried inside the LDL lipoproteins.
Okay.
So it's an indirect measure. It's kind of a guesstimate of the number of LDL lipoproteins. And in general, it will correlate, but sometimes it mismatches. So it is possible to have high LDL cholesterol and not be at risk, and it's possible to have normal LDL cholesterol and be building plaque, because these things mismatch, among other reasons. So it's kind of a guesstimate. It's a rough thing that is useful as a first readout, but just bear in mind that it's not foolproof.
And what is the right level of LDL and HDL that we should be seeing on our blood work?
Yeah, so the complication here is that it's basically a straight line. So it's not a threshold. It's not like a light switch on or off, right? It's essentially a straight line of risk, and then there's individual variation as well. But to give you a ballpark, so for ApoB, for people who are at low risk, so relatively young people that don't have documented heart disease, don't have a lot of plaque documented, under 80 milligrams per deciliter is a ballpark that is reasonable. If you are at higher risk, if you've had a heart attack before, if you had a stroke before, if you have a high calcium score, if you have a lot of documented plaque through some other imaging technique, if you have a very complicated family history, then you might want to go even lower, under 60, under 50. There's a bit of divergence there, but these are some goalposts for people to have an idea. In terms of LDL cholesterol, Basically, if your LDL cholesterol is under 80 milligrams per deciliter, this is American units. We'd have to do the math to convert to the Canadian and UK units. But under 80 is in general considered a very good level where we see very little, if any, buildup of plaque. But again, there's some individual variability, but that's kind of a ballpark.
Mm. And HDL, because a lot of people tend to have higher LDL all the time versus HDL.
Yeah, HDL is more of an indirect marker, but HDL per se, now we have a lot of evidence that HDL doesn't lower risk. So I know that a lot of people still ask, how do I raise my HDL? But the truth is that raising your HDL does not confer any protection per se. The exception to that is if the HDL goes up because of some lifestyle change that you made. Like, for example, let's say you're overweight and insulin resistant and your HDL is lower, which often happens in that population, and then you clean up your diet, you start exercising more, you lose weight, you become more insulin sensitive, and your HDL cholesterol rises a bit, which is not uncommon to see. Yes, that reflects this metabolic improvement, and all in all else held equal, you will have a lower cardiovascular risk. But it's not the HDL that lowered risk, if that makes sense. So it's just this thing that's
adjustment.
But it's not very reliable because sometimes HDL cholesterol can be high and you can be at high risk. Actually, there's some evidence of a U curve where people with very high HDL cholesterol have higher risk. So HDL cholesterol is an extremely tricky thing to hang your hat on. And so this idea of how do I raise my HDL is kind of an old-fashioned idea that no longer has scientific support. Yeah, I don't worry about HDL cholesterol much. I don't even look at mine, to be honest. I look at everything else. And if everything else, if I'm lean, if my ApoB is in the healthy range, glucose levels matter, absolutely. Blood pressure matters, all these things matter. But HDL cholesterol, I'm not particularly worried about.
I think I'm going to ask another question about cholesterol that comes up a lot, which is on social media, you will see the carnivore camp talking about people that have cancers or heart attacks having very low cholesterol. And that's why they harp on the fact that their high cholesterol is actually okay. What happens when we have episodes, especially acute ones, with cholesterol?
So there's a couple of things there. Sometimes they ask about people who have heart attacks with low cholesterol. That's one question. Another question are these U curves, these epidemiological studies showing a U curve between the level of cholesterol and the risk of mortality. So there are several things going on. In some of these studies, what's going on is they're measuring cholesterol levels acutely as the patient is admitted to the hospital in the acute setting of a heart attack, of a myocardial infarction. And what happens in that acute setting is your cholesterol drops abruptly right after you have in the setting of a heart attack. It's not even specific to heart attack. This happens with a lot of situations of shock, trauma, and infections. Cholesterol is what's called an acute phase reactant. And there's many of these parameters. So many of these parameters in your blood will change dramatically in one of these settings of disease. So when you have a patient coming into the hospital with a heart attack and you measure cholesterol a few hours or a day or two after the myocardial infarction, often the cholesterol will be lower artificially, like 30% lower than it was before they had the heart attack. So that's one factor. So we want to be careful with the temporality, right? You want to look at the levels of LDL cholesterol that lead up to the event. And really, with these chronic diseases, the key factor is not even the level of LDL cholesterol, it's time. Time is the number one factor. So it's exposure over time, as we were saying. If I smoke 3 packs a day, but I've been doing it for a week, that's not a high risk of lung cancer. But 1 pack a day over 30 years, much higher risk, right? So it's time. Time is the dominant risk factor. So that's one thing, that temporality aspect. Another factor is that often people who have heart attacks in our society are already on low lipid lowering treatment because they already had a high risk. They already had high lipids, or they had a lot of plaque, and so they're put on lipid lowering treatment. And then a percentage of those people have a heart attack. And so when you're looking retrospectively, that can trick you. Oh, look at all these people having heart attacks, and they're on a statin, so that statin is causing heart attacks. You have to look, again, prospectively. You have to take people from baseline, give statins to half of them, lower cholesterol, and see if those guys have more or less heart attacks than the guys who don't receive the statin, right? This has been done dozens of times in a randomized way, and statins overwhelmingly and unequivocally reduce risk of heart attacks and strokes in populations that have indication. So that's another thing. And then there's this other phenomenon of the U curves that is brought up a lot. This idea that people with low cholesterol die more. That is true statistically. If you look at a Western population and you look at people that have low cholesterol, you see a higher risk of death than people who have this intermediate to high-ish cholesterol, and then it goes up again into the very high cholesterol ranges. But the trick is that you see this pattern with a lot of parameters. You see this pattern with blood pressure, with BMI, with hemoglobin A1C. So, for example, you look at BMI, mortality, as you go into the normal BMI, mortality goes up. And the lowest mortality is seen around a BMI that's in the overweight range. And the same thing is seen with blood pressure and hemoglobin A1C. So it's not so much a cholesterol thing. It's kind of an effect of our society being pretty sick overall. And most people are in these ranges where blood pressure is a little high and BMI is a little high and cholesterol is a little high. And as they approach the final years of life, that last decade or so, these parameters tend to come down with disease, as we were talking about. So a lot of cancers and infections and chronic diseases lower, people lose weight, blood pressure comes down, BMI, hemoglobin A1C, and cholesterol levels often will drop in that last decade of life or so with these chronic diseases. So we're seeing an artifact of chronic diseases. Once again, we have to start with an unbiased population and follow them over time. And this has been done both in randomized trials and with genetics. So you can look at people starting out with genetics that lower their ApoB or their LDL cholesterol from birth, right? And you can follow them for life. And people who have these lower levels have like dramatically lower risks of heart attacks and even lower risks of mortality in these large data sets. So just to summarize, low cholesterol doesn't kill you. It's what lowered cholesterol that can kill you, depending on what it was. If you lower your cholesterol because you had cancer, yeah, that's not good. If you have lower cholesterol because you are frail and malnourished and in the last stages of life, yes, that's a bad sign. And some doctors even are scared of this. When somebody who's not cleaning up their diet, didn't start a lipid-lowering medication, and their cholesterol is gradually dropping over a year or 2 or 3 or 5, sometimes that's a red flag that there could be a cancer growing or something like that. It's not rare. But if you lower your cholesterol because you improved your lifestyle, or you cleaned up your diet, or you went on lipid-lowering treatment because you had indication for it, the evidence not only does not show higher mortality, it shows lower risk of heart disease and lower risks of mortality.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these studies, which are more complex and you have to look at different parameters, are taken out of context sometimes and to make the headline. And I guess a lot of people don't have the patience to look at studies or understand them even because they are written in a different language. Sometimes I'm like, okay, I need to translate this. They should do a Google Translate for medical language.
Yeah.
So Google, if you want to make money. Anyway, so I think you mentioned a couple of times the metabolic health of people, and A1C came up, and as someone that had a high A1C, went from type 2 pre-diabetic to now normal range, and I did it all with food. I didn't want to have, I thought, no, I'm 40, I don't want to take any medication, I know what it was causing it anyway. But how do we there is a trend again now when it comes to sugar levels, the spike. So everybody's freaking out about the spikes. Although I think we need to explain this, and you can do it better than anybody else. Talking about spikes being normal, because that's it's just a very physical reaction. We eat food, our blood glucose will go up, so that the insulin from the pancreas is released to bring it down. But people are freaking out about these spikes. And so we shouldn't have any if we eat something. So can we explain how the sugar metabolism works, so that people actually can get a picture of it and stop freaking out just because they're wearing a CGM?
So I think the key distinction to make here with all of these parameters is a sustained elevation versus an acute elevation, a temporary elevation. And this goes for everything. This goes for glucose levels, this goes for blood pressure, heart rate, all of this stuff. And so the example that a lot of people give, and we give in our videos a lot, is if you look at acute elevations, all kinds of things cause those. Exercise causes an elevation of blood pressure and heart rate, and actually intense exercise causes a peak of glycemia. It causes what's called it's an oscillation, but it's basically these acute changes. It goes up and it comes back down. And eating causes that routinely as well. So we're not worried about a change in parameters that's momentary, elevation of blood pressure during exercise, or elevation of glucose levels postprandially. So postprandial means after eating. That's completely physiological. There's nothing telling us that that's a problem. Actually, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that might actually be health promoting. What is problematic is a sustained elevation. So you're fasting and your glucose is sky high. That's a problem. Or you're at rest and your blood pressure is high. That's a problem, right? Also, if you eat something or your glucose spikes and it stays high for hours, that does indicate a metabolic issue, because your body should be able to handle that and remove the glucose from circulation postprandially. Be able to sequester that and to turn that into energy, right? Or store it. So that's a key distinction that gets missed a lot of times on social media, even sometimes by health professionals that talk about glucose levels are high, but don't make this distinction between sustained or like an acute, transient change. It's called a glucose excursion.
Yeah.
In nerd speak. So if you're going to be worried about glucose excursions or glucose peaks, then you should be worried about exercise. You should be worried about sleep. During phases of sleep, glucose also goes up and down. It doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is the sustained elevation. And what happens in people who have prediabetes or diabetes is their fasting levels are higher. Also postprandially, their levels are already starting from a higher point. Then the peak is really, really high, but it also stays high for longer. So the criteria for diabetes or prediabetes after a meal is after 2 hours, right? So the key point here is that the levels stay high. The body doesn't have the ability to bring those back down, either because it doesn't produce enough insulin, or the body isn't responding normally to insulin. It might even be producing too much insulin, but your body isn't responding to it. You have insulin resistance. So that's the concern, not the glucose going up, which is normal. Oscillations or excursions are completely physiological.
So when people, let's call them influencers. I mean, this is the thing. Sometimes the influencers that are speaking about this are educated. They're not, just silly people that are off the street. But talking about spikes, the glucose goes down after 2 hours for many of them. But what they are harping on is, well, it shouldn't go as high and it shouldn't come down as quickly. And I think that's where people get confused about the spikes and crashes. And then they're like, oh, yeah, well, this is way too high. And then it's coming down within 2 hours, but it's a sharp down trajectory because it's gone up a little more. Maybe you had like potatoes or something. And that's where I think it gets confusing for people, because they look at the charts and anything that does this for them is really worrisome. When we actually, in my opinion, from the opinion of people that I've interviewed who have actually type 1 diabetes and manage the insulin intake with a whole food plant-based diet that is very high in carbohydrates. Now I know this is not the only way, and I'm just taking one subset, but the worry about these spikes, and I think the spikes and the crashes are way different when we talk about eating a whole food versus junk food diet. That we'll do this, but probably you do this quite a bit because you're eating a lot of junk food all in your day. So the difference of that, I think, it's probably something that's confusing people, because now everybody's going out to get a CGM and they don't necessarily know how to read the charts.
Right. So I don't have anything against CGMs.
No, me neither. I love them.
For people who have diabetes or pre-diabetes, it can be very useful. My concern is that people are misinterpreting the evidence or the data that they're getting from the CGMs, and they're pathologizing something that is completely normal.
Yeah.
I think there is one element that could be added in terms of nuance, which is there's going to be individual variability also. There are people who don't have diabetes or pre-diabetes who might have these crashes and be hypoglycemic and be lightheaded after eating certain meals. That can happen individually, and that's not even a function. I mean, I've heard situations where these peaks and these overcompensations, the hypoglycemic troughs, mirror the subjective aspect, and then the person tailored their diet to avoid those and they felt better. I don't see a problem with that. In that case, it actually started subjectively. So the person felt this lightheadedness and these complaints after certain meals. And so they went about figuring out what was going on and they changed their diet. I think that's perfectly reasonable. But for somebody who's healthy and who's feeling fine and then is going to be in a state of panic because a graph shows an up and down, I don't think that makes any sense. In the absence of a symptom or something that, an actual complaint, or something that's documented. Yeah, if you feel fine, but your glucose is sky high, I think that is something to look into and to optimize. Or if it stays high very, very long after a meal, something to look into as well. Otherwise, I would be cautious with overinterpreting these traces on a piece of paper that don't match anything you're feeling or any scientific evidence.
Yeah, thank you. Something that comes up a lot, and I think obviously we went into details, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think this is really important. It's the body composition. So a lot of people hear the term skinny fat, and a lot of people think, well, I'm fine because I'm not overweight and my BMI is okay, but maybe internally they might have issues, and that could show up as, okay, you're not actually metabolically healthy when you do your blood work, but they don't see it, like they are looking okay, in terms of average. First of all, what is a skinny fat person? And then how do we readjust? So how do we work our body so we can recompose our composition? If it makes any sense.
Yeah. So I think what you're alluding to is this distinction between subcutaneous fat and visceral fat. This is crucial in this world of diabetes and insulin resistance, because there's a lot of evidence that subcutaneous fat is the fat that, as the name indicates, you store under the skin. Visceral fat is the fat that is stored around and inside the viscera, around and inside the organs, like the liver and the pancreas and these types of things. And it's the visceral fat that is more of a concern. In fact, there is some evidence that people who may look a little chubbier, because they store more fat peripherally under the skin, are actually protected from metabolic issues compared to people who store it more internally. They might look better, but if the fat is being stored around the organs, that's worse. So that's kind of it's really hard to just compare one person to one person. You have to look at all these factors, and you have to look at populationally and statistically. But so this goes back to Roy Taylor, who was one of the leading diabetes experts, and he has this idea of the personal fat threshold. His idea is that this cutoff, this threshold that determines that you become diabetic, is not a set threshold for everyone. It's not, oh, once you hit a BMI of 26.5, you will become diabetic. It's not like that. Everybody has a personal fat threshold where their risk goes up, where they start having these issues. And for some people, that threshold is really high. And that is why we have people who are morbidly obese and their glucose levels are fine and they're not, they're metabolically comparatively surprisingly fine. And then you have people who look skinny and they have a lot of issues. So again, this goes back to susceptibility, and the world is not entirely fair. There's genetics affects everything. So we have to play the card we're dealt, the hand we're dealt. One thing that Roy Taylor suggests also that helps is if you think about your size when you were in college, for example. A lot of people in our society are skinnier in their teens and early 20s, and then they start to gradually accrue body fat, right? And by the time they're 30 and 40, they're much bigger. And so they might not even look fat. People might not say anything. They might look trim. But if you think about the size and the weight that you had when you were in college, that might be a more relevant, at a personal level, a more relevant kind of rule of thumb. Yeah, that's one factor. I mean, Roy Taylor believes that this amount of fat that is stored and where it's stored is the only factor, is basically the one lever that controls diabetes and insulin resistance. I don't know if it's the only one, but I think we have compelling evidence that it's a major one. It's probably the biggest one.
Yeah.
For most people. And this is also the main way that people that remission of diabetes has been shown is via losing some excess fat mass. I don't know how you did it, but this is the way that's been most commonly documented.
Yeah, definitely did it with diet going. I mean, I was on a vegan diet still, but eating a lot of processed food, especially high fat, the BioLife cheeses, and other things. And then I was going through a very hard time, and food was my comfort. So lots of, like sourdough bread and then cheeses and things that I really would never eat before, but too many things. And then not really paying attention to my hormones. I definitely had adrenal fatigue. And I know this is a controversial topic, but I felt it. Like I was exhausted all the time and I was going through a very hormonal, like roller coaster. And not taking care of myself. I think there was a lot of emotional stuff as well, and that definitely affects your physiology. So I had to really redo everything. So I actually went mostly raw. I felt like my body needed to go to the most unaltered food. I do intermittent fasting. I started working out for what I think is good for my hormones. So as I said about the cycle, and unfortunately, a lot of information out there is really for man by man, because we are just taught traditionally to be smaller men, but we are not. So I had to really learn how my body as a woman works. And I found that it works really well to approach it that way. And for my clients as well, there's a lot of science that needs to be still uncovered, a lot of studies that should be done on women. So we're definitely a subset that is not looked after, but I did it this way. I went back to basics, like unadulterated food. And I felt like I actually changed my body composition. I've always been what you would define as skinny fat, or slim fat. Like you wouldn't see me as a fat person, but actually, yeah, I was overweight. I had extra fat. And so, yeah, that was for me such a big learning curve, scary, but very big learning curve. And I know it's an anecdote, it's my story, and as you said, it is a powerful thing, but a lot of people are, having the same experiences, and it just validates that lifestyle and diet are so important, but we need to tailor them to the specific needs of each person, because we are different and we have genetic components which will trigger how we react to things for sure. So I'm asking all my guests what they eat in a day. So I'd love to ask you, what is your standard or most popular diet choices per day?
It varies from day to day, but I eat a lot of, let's see, a lot of legumes. There is breakfast is the most standardized because I pretty much always eat some oatmeal with berries and some flax seeds and nuts and things like that mixed in. I sometimes throw in some protein powder as well. So that's kind of usually the standard breakfast. And then the rest of the meals, I'm not very dogmatic about it. So I'll eat when I'm hungry, and I'll eat as much as I feel like to satisfy hunger. And I'll sometimes not even call them lunch or dinner. I'll sometimes, if I'm not hungry at noon, I'll eat at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, whenever the hunger comes. Yeah, a lot of legumes for protein, some whole grains, some starchy vegetables as well, non-starchy vegetables, some seafood that I sometimes introduce, things like mussels, things like that are very common in Portugal. Although I eat a lot less of that now than I used to because of environmental concerns. What else? A lot of water, a lot of fruit. Yeah, occasionally some fish, but not, I wouldn't say that it's a staple. Yeah, those would be probably the most common things that you find. Yeah.
Nice. I recently discovered this tofu brush, because normally it's done with cod, right? And I'm probably not saying it right. Normally it's like bacalhau, a brush, right? A brush.
Yeah.
But I obviously don't eat bacalhau, so which is cod. So I tried the tofu one. It's delicious. So there are some amazing Portuguese recipes, traditional recipes that are being made by vegan vegetarian restaurants. And honestly, I'm blown away. I don't know how the original stuff actually tasted, but it tastes really good with the vegetarian options. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. We are really lucky here. I think we have access to really good produce. I'm just starting a project which launches in April, which is like a vegan market, and trying to really educate people about the difference between processed food versus whole foods. And, I'm talking to some of the farmers about bringing fresh produce. And it's just so nice to know that people are really still working with their hands in the land and really creating amazing food, which a lot of countries don't have the luck to have as much as here. So we really have access to awesome produce here. We're really lucky.
Yeah, I think Portugal is a great country to live in for a number of reasons. I think the food is good. I think it's a good mix. It's a good balance. You have resources, you have access to things, but it's not also too crazy. It's not. It's a moderate country in everything, I feel like.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I will keep you here for hours talking about all the health issues and going basically through your whole videos, making a podcast out of this. But I truly appreciate your time, and I'm so happy we made it happen. And I look forward to meeting you in person at some point. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Had a great time.
Anytime. Bye. Thank you, Dr. Carvalho, and thank you everyone for staying on for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about Nutrition Made Simple, go into the show notes. I've linked everything there. And of course, this is so helpful because this is a great resource for you if you are confused by the social headlines or influencers or media. I know, minefield. So if you go on this channel, you will learn so much. And I'm really grateful he was able to be here on the show so that we could ask him some awesome questions. In the meantime, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please do rate it, share it, make sure that you help us grow so we can invite more and more amazing speakers on. And in the meantime, I say bye, but I'll see you next week. Have a good one.